Nearly every company generates some kind of emissions to air, water, or soil. Smelters release contaminant particles and gases from the smelting process. Mines release particles from blasting and crushing ore and moving it from place to place. These pollutants can go into the air, water, or soil. That impacts the health and livelihoods of communities and harms wildlife and ecosystems. To prevent these impacts, companies are expected to manage their emissions. Here, we'll show you how you can minimize your pollution impacts through your management system. We'll cover the policies, risk assessments, procedures, and monitoring and mitigation. First, make sure pollution is covered in your environmental policy. Your policy should commit to meeting all the regulations on pollution, and it should commit to mitigating the impacts of your pollution by following the mitigation hierarchy. It states that you aim to avoid impacts. If you cannot, then you minimize the impact. Next, restore environments affected. And finally, offset what you cannot manage. You'll first need to understand your potential impacts, so conduct a risk assessment. Check that you are in compliance with local environmental regulations with all of the necessary permits. For example, to discharge pollutants, you may need a permit. Maintain the permit by ensuring you meet its requirements, like keeping concentrations below the regulator's limit. Gather baseline data about your emissions to air, water, and land. What types of pollution do you generate? What activities generate pollution? Are any emissions harmful when released into the air, water, or land? For example, some refrigerants can damage the ozone layer if they leak. Maintain any coolers on site. If you have to replace the refrigerant, that indicates a leak. Identify all the sources of pollution in your operations. For example, stormwater runoff can carry sediment from your site into nearby soil and water bodies, polluting them. It's far easier to prevent runoff than to capture it and treat the water. Evaluate which sources produce the most pollution and which are the most likely to cause harm, such as hazardous substances. These create the greatest risk, so make them top priority. To put improvements into practice, develop procedures. Design them to ensure that you meet legal and customer standards. Establish a process to measure and monitor emissions to air, water, and land. Set targets to reduce the use and emission of polluting substances. Each year, review your targets to adjust. Develop strategies to meet your targets, following the mitigation hierarchy. The best choice is to avoid the impact. For instance, if a process uses a harmful chemical, change the process so that chemical is no longer needed. Design the impact out of operations. If you can't avoid it, you can act to minimize the damage. Set controls that reduce the use of pollutants to begin with, and then at the end, treat any emissions. For example, discharging heated water can warm up parts of lakes or rivers, damaging the ecosystem. To minimize the impact, you could first limit the amount of hot water used, and then you could ensure the remaining hot water is cooled or dispersed before release. If you have created an impact, act to restore the environments that were affected. For example, if your operations contaminated a waterway, you can take steps to clean up the pollution. Finally, if the impacts can't be managed, you can offset the impacts. For example, suppose pollution from your site affected local farms, lowering yields and damaging livelihoods. You could offset the impact through livelihood replacement activities. Over time, monitor how much pollution you produce. Measure your progress in meeting your targets and adjust your strategy accordingly. Report on your progress to stakeholders who may be concerned or affected by your emissions. Provide data and describe your mitigation strategy. For example, if your air emissions are blowing downwind to farms, the farmers would be concerned that it could damage their crops. Talk to the farmers. Show them how you mitigate the issue and how you monitor your impacts. Reassess your performance in managing your waste regularly, such as every 2 to 3 years. When you introduce new processes or waste, reevaluate your waste management. Monitor your impacts on the environment. By managing your pollution emissions, you protect your company and the communities around you, and you meet the expectations of the law and your customers.